explain the structure of the session today. So the first part will be Fiona's public presentation, followed by about 15 minutes of questions, public question and answer. And then we will move to a breakout room for the second part. And this is a formal examination that's open only to Fiona, her dissertation committee members, and other graduate faculty and iSchool graduate students. And we will have questions and comments from the committee at that time. We will then ask Fiona to step out, as well as any non-committee members who had come into the room. And then we will have our discussion, and then we will all return to the main Zoom room to celebrate with Fiona her progress toward this very important milestone. Thank you all for coming, and Fiona, please take it away.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very happy to be defending today, despite the circumstances, which is ever so slightly strange, obviously. So I am going to just set my screen sharing up here, and hopefully everybody can now see the right screen. You just, and I'm gonna just get rid of that for a second, because that's the very end of my presentation. All right, there we go. But as you can see, I'm going to thank everybody at the end. You should all see that the title screen, correct? Everyone sees that? Okay, good. Okay, we're cooking with gas, as they say. So I want to start by getting you to imagine that you're one of the 4 out of every 5 women who will have a baby in their lifetime. You want to give your baby the very best, and that includes breast milk because of all the great benefits, right, to both you and baby. So before giving birth, you take a breastfeeding class, you read books, you talk to your friends and family, because breastfeeding is the most natural thing in the world, right? But like so many new mums, you struggle. So in your postpartum fog, you try to remember everything that you learned. In hospital, nurses give you different advice. The lactation consultant pops in for maybe 5 minutes and confuses you more. Maybe your baby is in the neonatal intensive care unit and you can't even pick them up. So, but perhaps nursing is excruciating because your baby is one of the increasing number with a tongue tie. But whatever the problem, your baby isn't getting your milk, so you turn to a breast pump to get out that precious liquid gold. This isn't how you imagine breastfeeding, but your baby's still getting your milk, and that's what's most important. But there wasn't anything in what you read or learned about only pumping. Your lactation consultant maybe says it's not going to work. Your friends just keep saying, keep trying to latch, it'll be fine. Your head is swimming, and all you need is reassurance that how you're feeding your baby is okay. So after hours of frantic Googling, you find out that what you're doing has a name: exclusive pumping, EPing. You hadn't heard of EPing before, perhaps because it's a relatively new phenomenon, but also because there's no research out there focused on it. So most lactation consultants don't know much about it. Right now, social media like Facebook is the main source of information about exclusive pumping, which perhaps isn't ideal. That's where my research comes in. Approaching public health from an information studies perspective, I researched the lived experiences of exclusive pumpers, focusing on the information that they need, seek, and use, and how that affects their breastfeeding outcomes. In my presentation today, I'll share how I collected data from over 2,000 exclusive pumpers, what I found out about how they feel and how long they exclusively pumped for, and the information would have made the journey easier. I'll leave you hopefully with an understanding of why it's so important that the lived experiences of exclusive pumpers are understood, particularly by lactation consultants and those who train them, and why it is vital that we eliminate the double letdown of nursing failure and poor lactation care for the only alternative that provides these babies with that optimal infant nutrition. So it's probably worth at this point giving a little bit of background and reiterating exactly what exclusive pumping is. And it's defined slightly differently depending on the study that you read, but I defined it as not feeding baby directly at the chest or breast. And it doesn't necessarily mean 100% human milk, but just that human milk comes from pumped milk as opposed to directly at the breast. And for the purposes of my study, at least, these participants may have tried to nurse at some point, or may have indeed been successful. either before or after exclusive pumping. But what mattered for my study was that people had been exclusive pumpers at some point in time. But let's take a step back from that and ask why breastfeeding matters to begin with. Well, there are plenty of health benefits of milk and lactation. So human milk is ever changing and it's very complex, like the image that you see on the screen there. This is all of the contents that we know of so far. It responds to the age of the breastfed child. It produces antibodies in response to environmental pathogens, so coughs and colds and all those kinds of things. And it helps to prevent various illnesses and SIDS as well in babies. For the breastfeeders themselves, it does lower the risk of certain cancers, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. And there are also benefits at a societal level, saving money in hospitals for premature babies, and just the knock-on effect of all of those health benefits. But really, that's, whether you want to debate about the benefits of breast milk itself, the point still remains that it's central to the idea of mothering for many people who identify as mothers. And it's sort of core to the perception of nurturing and continuing to sustain their child, like once they've given birth and it's outside the womb. And there is this perception that is the most natural thing in the world. So it should be something that, comes easily and, something that we should all do. Those kinds of things pervade our sense of what breastfeeding is and what it means. So what happens when breastfeeding is challenging? Because this happens a lot. Many people face breastfeeding challenges, difficulty latching, painful nipples, mastitis, which is a breast infection or inflammation, and then of course there are those who are separated from their child because of, they're in the NICU, they're sick, that kind of thing. And these problems often lead to early cessation of breastfeeding. So people don't breastfeed as long as they want a lot of the time. And this really leads to some pretty negative emotions: guilt, grief, failure. These are just some of the words that have been associated with not reaching those breastfeeding goals in previous research. It's a pretty traumatic experience for many people to not reach those breastfeeding goals. So if direct nursing is not possible, and direct nursing by that I mean at the breast, or it's not desired, which is another choice that people can make, there is a choice between exclusive pumping and infant formula. And in about the last century, infant formula has been the default choice. But many more people, increasingly more people, are choosing exclusive pumping. But do we really know how many people? Well, no, not really. But we have some data. It's not particularly that current necessarily. 10 years ago in the US, about 5 to 7%. One study found as high as 20. Australia is about 4%. But again, that's sort of relatively old data. This is going to be a test your flag knowledge round of my dissertation defense. This is Singapore. Even 10 years ago, they were up to about 18%. And then recently in China, a study found 23%, so almost 1 in 4 at 6 weeks postpartum were exclusively pumping. So it's kind of all over the place. What's an educated guesstimate? In speaking with other lactation consultants and those within the breastfeeding and lactation field, I think it's sort of a general sense that it's perhaps about 10% in the US. But what does that really mean? How many people really is that every year? So based on births in the US in 2018, about 3.2 million new parents left the hospital breastfeeding. So that's potentially over 300,000 EPs every single year just in the United States. And to put that into perspective, prostate cancer cases in 2019, 175,000. Breast cancer, 270,000. So the number of EPs is more than those. So that's quite a lot. So we must have loads of data, right? Because when something affects that many people, we collect data. But that's not so true. there is hardly any data on exclusive pumping or exclusive pumpers themselves. Some data is starting to emerge about, for example, composition of milk, how that changes, potentially contamination of pumped milk from breast pump parts, but we don't actually know what that means for the children themselves. We just know what it means in a lab. And then there are still questions about storage of milk, the effect of the containers. Of course, we know all about plastics these days. So what effect does that have, you know, short-term and long-term? And there's just a lot of unanswered questions about the action of bottle feeding itself. That's something that's incredibly understudied as well. But those aren't the gaps that my research is trying to fill. My research fills or tries to fill other gaps. And some of these gaps include why exclusive pumping, what are the information needs, seeking and use of exclusive pumpers, what problems do exclusive pumpers have, both physical problems, logistical problems, emotional issues as a result of EPing. Where did they get their support and who did they get their support from? How did they feel about exclusive pumping? And then what can we actually do to improve the lived experiences of these people? With the overarching goal of my research is to examine the socio-ecological factors that influence exclusive pumping and the lived experiences of exclusive pumpers. So that's a mouthful, but what does that really mean? So what's a socio-ecological framework? So this kind of is in the background of my work, and it's how I approached various parts of my data analysis and my dissertation. It's an amalgamation of previous work by Bronfenbrenner and McElroy and others. And this framework allows us to put the person in the middle and then assess the influences on them at a variety of different levels. So we work from their close family, friends, community, and then we work outwards through social influences, societal influences, social norms, for example, and then, you know, all the way out to the influence of time passing itself. So this is sort of the background for how I looked at sort of the factors influencing exclusive pumpers. But how did I actually collect the data on these various influences? Well, this is the breastfeeding without nursing study. So it involved surveys, both qualitative and quantitative data collection within those surveys. And there were two sort of angles of the data collection. One was an initial survey, which was for current and former exclusive pumpers. It was about 170 questions. That sounds like a lot. It was a lot, but nobody answered all of them because of the way it was. People were routed through. They were recruited mainly from online groups, so it was a convenient sample, and that was between 2017 and 2018. And then I also did follow-up surveys, and that was open to anyone who had answered the initial survey who was still currently exclusively pumping, and that was a 2-month follow-up every 2 months, which then switched to every month. Until they finished exclusive pumping. So that started in May of 2017, and I still had a couple of people who were still pumping in October 2018. So that followed them through about 18 months of their exclusive pumping journey. But for the dissertation, I concentrated just on the initial survey, and this included questions about their details of each exclusive pumping journey. So that's each child or children they exclusively pumped for, their reasons for exclusive pumping, obviously information, where did they get it, what did they need, and then also their experiences, other people's reactions, things like that, and any problems that they had, and also their feelings about exclusive pumping in general. So of course, as with any study, there are some limitations to this. The sample was predominantly white, predominantly US, about 85% US, and then adding in other predominantly white English-speaking countries like Canada, UK, Australia, it went up to about 94%. So pretty much those countries. The participants themselves had generally quite a high level of income and a high education level. So we have to keep all of that in mind, looking at the findings. Some of the survey questions, you live and learn with these things, and Some of them could have been interpreted in different ways or ways that I didn't necessarily intend. And then also some of the questions had multiple responses were allowed, but I never asked people to rank them. So it was very difficult to tell maybe which was the most important result. And then, of course, researcher bias is always a problem, or not necessarily a problem, but certainly an aspect of this. And for anyone who knows me, knows that I was an exclusive pumper, and that is indeed how I came upon this research. So, of course, I have my own biases from my own experience, but hopefully by collecting a wide range of information, qualitative and quantitative, and I also had a couple of very good research assistants helping me analyze some of the qualitative data that weren't related to exclusive pumping in any way. Hopefully I've been able to, represent the findings in a fair way. But I had one other problem. And my other problem was I had too much data. I had so much data. So to give you an idea of how much data I had almost 2,500 people start the survey. And once they had reached the threshold to be included in the data analysis, it was just over 2,000. The average response time was just over 40 minutes. So people really did spend a long time answering and sharing their stories with me. And I can't be more grateful to them for doing that. But it did lead to a lot of data. And then if you printed out the raw data, it would take about 10,000 pages. So that's a lot. Obviously, I didn't print that out because I like trees. And then just taking the open-ended responses from the initial survey alone, it was over 500,000 words. And that's the equivalent of about 10 novels. So there was just a lot of data, so that, that was a good problem, but it took a long time to wade through some of that data. But what did my data tell me? So I limited the scope of my analysis for my dissertation. And by that, I mean that I concentrated in on these 3 core systems at the middle. So what does that mean? So the interpersonal, I looked at the participants' reasons for breastfeeding, why they exclusively pumped, why and when they stopped, as well as individual influences such as milk supply, their labor and delivery and pregnancy, their emotional experiences, their mental health experiences, those kinds of things. For the microsystem, remember that's their close communities. So that includes their child. So issues such as latching or whether their child is ill, whether they maybe had twins or triplets, that kind of thing. And also looked at their in-person social support from family and friends and lactation consultants that they actually saw, and also looked at their workplace, whether they had supportive workplaces or not. And then the mesosystem. So this is where I looked at information, experience, and behavior. So that would be their, EP is information needs, seeking, sources, the outcomes of that information. And also I focused on 3 sort of specific topics of information that sort of came through quite clearly within my data. And I also then looked at the role of online support groups, because of course, having been recruited from online support groups, that generally played a large part in these exclusive pumpers' experiences. But for today, I'm going to focus on the information question here, and just going to focus on a couple of the findings that were quite interesting to do with information. So the number 1 theme was what would have made exclusive pumping better. It's a very general question. The number 1 theme that came from that analysis was information. And a lot of people said earlier, they wanted information earlier. But what does this mean? Well, one of the things that I found was when I asked, when did these participants first hear the term exclusive pumping? Over almost 3/4 only found out about the term. They heard it for the very first time after they gave birth. So they gave birth, perhaps had breastfeeding problems, but hadn't heard of exclusive pumping. So this participant described stumbling across the term. And this was something that came up in quite a lot of people's responses, is that they sort of serendipitously found the information. They sort of stumbled across it while they were looking for information about other things. And many participants described sort of a sense of relief, or finally finding the word and finding what they could search for on Google. Because that's key. If you don't know the right term, you can't search for it. And so they finally felt, that they had a way to go forward and also a place to find like-minded people. But it did have some consequences, or at least it had some associations. There were certain emotions that were reported more often by those who had only heard the term exclusive pumping after birth: abandoned, frustrated, rejected. So, hearing it before birth, knowing about it perhaps, could potentially improve exclusive pumpers' experiences. But it wasn't that these people didn't do any prenatal education. Okay, it's not that they sort of just, gave birth and they hadn't done anything to find out about breastfeeding, because they had. Okay, many respondents had taken classes, either birth and parenting classes, general classes, or they'd taken a specific breastfeeding class. And as you can see from this bar chart, the blue indicates the proportion of those classes that even mentioned exclusive pumping. And for those classes, only about 1/4 of them actually even mentioned exclusive pumping. And then only about 4% of them even explained what it was. Even in a breastfeeding class, only about 4% explained what exclusive pumping even was. So it's not really any wonder that these people are giving birth and they don't know what it is, because the places that they go to find the information are not giving them that information. And so it had profound consequences. This particular participant said that they wouldn't have had such a hard time had they have known. They maybe wouldn't have felt, they felt that they had failed at breastfeeding, but wish that they hadn't have known that that was their only choice, because, perhaps then they wouldn't have felt like they had failed so much. So, but breastfeeding education did make participants feel more knowledgeable. Okay, so it's not, but there's an also but. The knowledge was limited to direct nursing issues, so things to do with nursing at the breast. So this particular graph shows that the participants perceived knowledge about some breastfeeding topics, and this was it was asked when you first started EPing, how knowledgeable did you feel about these issues? So the first 4, direct nursing, how to latch, issues with nursing, and also how to supplementary pump, so how to pump while also nursing at home perhaps and pumping at work. These were all strongly correlated with the amount of breastfeeding education. So people felt more knowledgeable the more breastfeeding education they had. However, the last set of bars shows that there's no correlation between breastfeeding education and how knowledgeable people felt about how to exclusively pump. So breastfeeding education didn't really help to educate people about how to exclusively pump, which is not really a surprise given that, it's barely mentioned or explained. So this participant took a class, they did what they supposed to do, and that class didn't even talk about pumping, pretty much. And it didn't even talk about pumping when you went back to work. So this was something that this class obviously felt, is something that they, someone doesn't need to worry about. And this was a US participant, and as we know, maternity and parental leave here in the US is not mandated. So some people have to go back to work in just a couple of weeks. So, if this person had managed to establish breastfeeding in those couple of weeks, and then they had to go back to work and pump, they wouldn't have that information unless they had spent their own, time trying to find out what they needed to know. But interestingly, there are some emotions that are also reported more by those who had had more breastfeeding education, not less, more. So these were grief, frustration, inadequacy, but also devotion. And I think that this is a really interesting finding, because breastfeeding education very often highlights the benefits of breastfeeding and does sort of highlight how natural it is, and sort of there's also this image of this peaceful baby at the breast suckling away, but there's also criticism of it for not covering the challenges of breastfeeding, and this has been found in various research before mine, that breastfeeding education isn't holistic, doesn't set people up to deal with the problems that may occur. So those who had more breastfeeding education perhaps had higher expectations, They perhaps had a higher commitment to breastfeeding because they had taken these classes, and they maybe had a higher degree of optimism because that's what they had been sort of led to believe or taught through these classes. So that when nursing didn't work out, they had a greater sense of grief and inadequacy and frustration. But because they were working through these challenges, they perhaps felt more devoted. But I think this is something that, you know, is an interesting angle for future research to find out kind of what really is behind that. So these breastfeeders overcame their challenges to still feed their own milk to their children. But where did they actually get their exclusive pumping information from if they're not getting it from breastfeeding education? And how useful is that information? Because, you know, you can get information, but it might not be, you know, good information or information that is useful. So these are the top 4 sources of information. So the number 1 was, unsurprisingly, online support groups. Well, of course, I recruited from online support groups, so this isn't entirely surprising. And websites were also very popular as well. But this, I mean, yes, it's not surprising that online support groups were the most popular, but these people had mostly all seen lactation consultants as well. So it wasn't that they hadn't tried to find information out elsewhere. It was just that those sources of information weren't as useful. As you can see in the top there was sort of a split between very useful and not very useful information from lactation consultants, whereas the information that people got from online support groups was predominantly very useful. So here's a couple of participants. This, you know, the first one gained a plethora of information. They could ask any question and you know, they would get an answer. But this wasn't done blindly by a lot of participants. Many did say something about the anecdotal nature or the experiential nature of the information, that it wasn't based on, you know, findings in research or that kind of thing. So many did actually check with another source, you know, whether that was, you know, checking several different groups to sort of get a consensus, or whether they looked on another website, or even asked a lactation consultant about whatever it was that they had found out on the group. And there were some very good lactation consultants. I don't want this to all be like, let's bash the lactation consultants. You know, I am one. So, you know, I know that good care out there exists, and some participants did indeed get that. But the overwhelming majority didn't have great experiences. They had poor support and information for exclusive pumping. Many felt that lactation consultants concentrated only on direct nursing, and then this has some profound negative effects as well. For example, maybe increased guilt and feelings of failure when it didn't work out. You know, the second participant here said that their intense emotional pain might have been easier had they have had a bit more validation of exclusive pumping. And there was one very surprising and strong association that I found to do with the usefulness of information from lactation consultants. And this was to do with seeking medical help for breast health problems. So this could be things, you know, related to lactation and pumping, like, you know, sore nipples, clogs, mastitis, ranging from the relatively minor to the relatively serious. And what I found was that when participants had a breast health problem, whether they sought medical help was strongly associated with how useful they rated the exclusive pumping information they received from lactation consultants. So as you can see here, the people who only rated lactation consultant information as not at all useful, only about 1/3 sought medical help for when they had a breast health problem. Whereas those who rated that information as very useful, half of them sought medical help. And this is a really concerning finding, I think, because not seeking medical help could potentially have really dire consequences. And this definitely deserves more investigation, you know, with some more data points and things like that sort of weren't available through my study. But it's certainly something that deserves investigation. But that said, what information would have helped them and what would EPers have found useful? So these are the top three: how often, how long to pump, how to maintain supply, and flange sizing. So this is something that the lactation consultants who are watching right now, should jot down. And then this was all of the other things that I put in there to ask about how useful the information was. And the one that I want you to really pay attention to is this getting back to the breast. So this is getting baby back to nursing directly at the breast. And this was the least important information for exclusive pumpers. But it was really important to some exclusive pumpers, so I can't discount that. But it does highlight the need for lactation consultants to use their counseling skills and find out exactly what information and support the person who is actually sitting in front of them wants and needs, rather than just assuming that the next course of action is to try and get the baby back to the breast. This participant felt that getting back to the breast was the only solution. That was the only solution that they felt they had been offered. And they felt that came from a lack of understanding and education about exclusive pumping. So this getting back to the breast doesn't take into account actually why exclusive pumpers exclusively pump. There is sort of a bit of a perception that it's a lifestyle choice. Well, looking into that a little bit more, when offered a list of options, which participants could select multiple from, couldn't latch was almost 3/4 of the people who answered the survey couldn't latch, and that was the reason that they exclusively pumped. And as you can see, we have about 1/4 that had children in the NICU, so that they were sort of separated from their child for the most part. But taking out the NICU population, who were separated from their child, at least 83% of the people in the survey who didn't have children in the NICU had tried to latch. And it was probably more than that. So we're really seeing these people want to direct nurse, but it's not working. So they're not choosing between direct nursing and exclusive pumping. They're choosing between exclusive pumping and formula. So it's really important to go forward with that information, knowing that there's a whole host of ramifications from not meeting breastfeeding goals, potential times and places that intervention could have been given to try and get that baby to the breast earlier. But I also asked why in their own words, and many of the same problems came out. So latch problem, many participants had babies who were losing weight, and so they felt that they had to either needed to monitor or wanted to monitor their intake. NICU was a big one, obviously. But this idea of a frustrated baby came out as well. And there wasn't really any explanation or any clear reasons for frustrated baby. It was just this idea of my baby was frustrated at the breast, pushing them away or crying, screaming while trying to nurse at the breast. And I think, it probably shows that, we give parents this idea of this calm nursing baby, all sort of sweetness and fluffiness and nice, where it's maybe not the reality. And we maybe need to look more into what's happening when this is a frustrated baby at the breast, more, ways to support and more information about what that really means, what that looks like, and what parents can actually do about it. So given that many participants had frustrated babies who were screaming and pushing them away at the breast, you can imagine that they had some feelings about that and about exclusive pumping in general. So these were the words from a specific list that were selected by 20% of the participants, at least 20% of the participants. And the most prevalent were negative, and that wasn't because the list was no more negative than positive. It's just that sort of this frustration and challenge and discouraged comes out. But devoted and strong come out as well. So there's some good things. And when looking at the feelings that participants shared in their own words, it was more positive. So feels good about giving their milk. So this is sort of a consolation prize. Okay, they couldn't nurse at the breast, but you know what? I could still feed them my milk. Glad to give the best start. But and pride was a big one. They were very proud of doing this achievement of still providing their milk. But there's a lot of anger, a lot of grief, mourning the loss of nursing. But these feelings did get better over time as sort of logistics of pumping got easier. They got more into a routine. People sort of felt a little bit better about the situation and felt it was a little bit easier. So given all of that, what are the conclusions here, just from this little snippet of the information? Most exclusive pumpers don't want to exclusively pump. There are some who choose it. And we should support those people just as much as we support any other breastfeeder. But knowing that this was not necessarily the first choice for many of these people really kind of guides us in providing services and information to them. But clearly they were highly motivated and committed to providing human milk for their babies. And this played out in some of the, this is another little snippet of findings, but it plays out. So the mean duration in my study of EPing was over 8 months, which is like really amazing. And then those who were still exclusively pumping at 6 months postpartum, so their babies turned 6 months, was over 3/4 were still pumping at 6 months. To give that some context, in the US, any breastfeeding at 6 months, only 58% are still doing any kind of breastfeeding at 6 months. So that's much higher than the sort of general US population. And then the mean age of ceasing to feed some human milk was over 10 months. So this is people stop pumping at an average of 8 months, but they have freezer milk, that kind of thing. So these babies are getting milk for quite some time. Which basically leads to the fact that exclusive pumping is sustainable. It's physiologically sustainable. In a group of participants who had a good online support system and relatively good family and friend support systems, they managed to sustain exclusive pumping for a relatively long amount of time. But there's still this big information gap where they need better support, better information, and that came especially from lactation consultants, the experts on lactation, the people from whom these participants expected to get this information. They were not getting it from them. So what does that mean for future work? Well, obviously, I'm going to continue analyzing the breastfeeding without nursing study data. There's all of the follow-up study data to analyze, so I can get like a look at how the experiences potentially change over time. There's also research to be done as a method of breastfeeding. So there really aren't any longitudinal studies exploring the outcomes for children, for the breastfeeders themselves, sort of health, development, emotional, psychological impacts of exclusive pumping in the long term. There's also not much data on pumping habits. For example, how many times a day, how long each pump is, what that means for milk supply. Are there any connections between that and the height, weight, age, that kind of thing of exclusive pumpers? And this idea of milk composition over time as well. We know that milk changes in response to age and environment and things like that when a baby's being nursed at the breast. But we don't really have that data for exclusive pumping. Does it change in the same way? Are there things in it that are different? Those kinds of things. And then as an information issue, there's obviously risks associated with receiving quasi-medical information from social media, particularly in the past few years, even since I did the study, social media influencers have really risen up, and there are really some lots of, like, for example, Instagram accounts that have thousands of followers, and they're giving advice or putting out information. What does that mean? But then what's the effect of not accessing that information? There are some people who don't access that information, and that has effects too. So it's looking at those kinds of issues as an information issue as well. And of course, the effect of information on people's future behaviors. We saw that there was an association between, not seeking medical help when you had poor information from a lactation consultant. Well, was that directly related? Did people feel, or was that just, something in my data? We really should explore that some more. So then also, obviously, I plan to continue sharing my research and advocating for exclusive pumpers, both within the lactation field itself with lactation consultants, within breastfeeding and lactation science more generally. Some of these future research directions, I would love to branch out and work with others doing that kind of study, study in science already. And then also within the information field, of course, looking at those information issues. So there's some past conferences on this list, but also some future ones that have mostly gone online for the time being. So, you know, looking at those. And then, of course, future directions, have to thank everybody. So thank you so much to my study participants. Obviously, I could definitely not have done it without them. They were incredibly committed. They have continued to support me throughout this whole PhD, and their enthusiasm for me doing this research has really helped, you know, through some of the more difficult times, but also just kept me enthusiastic about it. And of course, my friends and family, I couldn't have done it without them. Their support, particularly in the last few months, when I have been furiously writing away in the middle of a pandemic. And then my committee, they were all introduced earlier, but I must thank you know, all of them for their support and their comments and guidance, and ideas and thoughts, and just their time reading what turned out to be an immense dissertation, rather large. And then if anyone wants to get in touch, I would very much welcome that. And here are my details. So I think it's time to pass it back to Beth.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, Fiona. So now we have some time for a few questions from the general audience. And then just to remind you, we're then going to go into a breakout room, and we're gonna borrow Fiona for a little bit, but please stick around if you have questions, because I believe Fiona's going to come back into the main session and continue to field questions if anybody has any. And we'd like you to stick around and celebrate her progress with us a little bit later when the committee comes back into the main session as well. So please, does anybody have any questions? Maybe use the hand feature.
Beth, can you see them, or should I exit my screen to look at them?
That's what I was just trying to tell.
I'm here because if I do,
where would it?
There we go. Oh, there's one question there.
Can you tell who is
it was Carol.
Carol,
Boston.
Okay.
I think you could unmute yourself if you want to ask it.
Thanks,
and I also
Fiona.
see Nikki as well.
So thank you. That was a super interesting presentation. I feel like we've been walking with you for on this topic for a little while.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's wonderful. Did you have a chance in any capacity to share some of your findings or do any interviews with the lactation consultants, since they seem to be such an interesting audience for you? Like, did they not know any characteristics of the population, or is this some bias toward the breast, or?
Well, I mean, I've spoken with many lactation consultants, you know, and I have presented at lactation consultant conferences as well. And there is definitely a bias towards the breast. You know, I can, you know, to some degree understand that. It is what is the biological norm, right? And, you know, we have found some associations between, you know, feeding out the breast and sort of some improved outcomes, or there's starting to be some evidence that pumped milk, you know, has some differences, which is not particularly shocking since it's a whole different method of feeding. But I think there is certainly this perception that it's a lifestyle choice, rather than it being something that most people didn't want. And I have had conversations after, you know, after presentations at lactation conferences where, you know, people have said, thank you so much for, like, you know, sharing this and like giving me an insight into this population that, you know, I sort of had a different idea of. And now I have this sort of, you know, a different perception of them, and that will really help me sort of move forward. So I definitely have that, you know, and I have experienced some pushback as well. As you know, usually a couple of people after my presentation who will come up and say, pumping isn't breastfeeding. And anyone in the exclusive pumping world will defend, furiously defend, rightfully so, I think, that pumping is breastfeeding. You know, and yeah, so it's changing. The perceptions are changing, for sure, but there's definitely more work to be done. Thank you, Carol. I think I saw Nikki's hand next, perhaps. So I can, yeah. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Fiona. That was lovely. It's
Thank
always
you.
good to speak. I have my own little area of particular interest. When you talk about 83%, I believe that's the statistic you use, of exclusive pumpers wanted, they put the baby to rest.
Mm-hmm.
And I have
Yeah.
do you gather any data about what their experience was in hospital? And I guess I should explain my own slant on this, is I really feel that the way breastfeeding is taught in hospitals is counterproductive. And I'm wondering if, did you get any, did someone take my breast and shove it into my baby's mouth? Did you have data about that?
Yeah, I didn't ask specifically about that period of time in any quantitative question, but many participants shared their hospital experiences in their open-ended questions. And yeah, that was, the lactation consultants in hospital were probably the worst rated. And then because people didn't have a choice really who they went to, and then after, once they got home and if they continued to see a lactation consultant, they were probably a bit more choosy about who they went to, or they could at least talk to them on the phone or something ahead of time or get a recommendation, right? And there were some people who went into hospital planning to exclusively pump, and they would sort of just disregarded. Basically, a lot of the time they were just like, no one knew what to do with me, like I just didn't see anyone, or they just let me get on with it, blah blah blah, even if they were having some issues, potentially, because there are still obviously plenty of lactation issues that can occur even when you're exclusive pumping, right? That would a lactation consultant would be very helpful for. And yeah, there was some people who had negative experiences in that sense as well. Like they were, breasts were being shoved, babies were being, pushed into the breast, those kinds of things. There were some participants that had that experience, but I think it was mostly just the not offering alternatives as sort of as soon, or that they had a baby that was there that hadn't eaten yet, hadn't latched, and they weren't being taught either any hand expression, or they weren't being offered a pump until they maybe asked for it, or they asked for a pump but then they weren't shown how to use it, or I have some thoughts about whether pumping is ideal in the first couple of days postpartum anyway, but beside the point, if your client is, a patient is there asking for something, you should certainly respond. So there was definitely that. Yeah, there was definitely some hospital nightmare experiences.
I would like to work with you more later. We can't do that now, but we'll be.
Yeah, for sure. You got it. Okay, so I saw Courtney's hand, and then I see a physical hand being raised. So let's go to Courtney next. I've unmuted you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. So I'm interested if you have any information or data about the types of discussions that were taking place in the online communities, and I guess I'm wondering that because, or were the participants sharing information based on personal experience more so, or were they like bouncing around ideas about lactation consultants that were helpful, or was it more just was it more like an emotional support and okay, other women are doing this and I feel validated, or
yeah, I get where you're going with that. Yes to all. I didn't specifically do any content analysis of any of the Facebook group posts or anything like that, because that was not my plan. It was not what was in the in the scope of the study. I'm not sure the groups would particularly appreciate that because they're private groups, understandably. But I mean, I've been part of these groups now for 4 years myself. So I can certainly answer that just from my own experience of the groups. I'm admin of one that has over 6,000 members. And it tends to be sort of both emotional and informational and practical support. So the practical support would be, you know, things like logistics of pumping and like pumping schedules and how many times a day and things like that. The informational would be sort of information on, you know, I don't know, like lactation issues, I suppose, you know, one could classify them as. You know, milk does change, for example, in response to the environment and things like that. I have pictures to prove it. You know, exclusive pumpers know that their milk looks different when their baby is sick. You know, things like that. You know, information about where to get pumping parts, different kinds of pumps, different kinds of accessories, things like that. And then the emotional support is a huge factor. You know, people struggling through and getting just that emotional support, that encouragement, that kind of thing, is a super important aspect of it as well. So it really is like a place for all different kinds of support. And whether it comes to, is it anecdotal, is it lactation consultant, is it evidence-based? I think a lot of that depends on the group as well. For example, my group that I'm part of, one of the reasons I made it kind of my home group, I was part of a bunch of them, but one of the reasons I made that particular group sort of captured my heart, so to speak, is because they're all about science. So, you know, pro science, pro vaccination, you know, like anything that's sort of woo woo gets kind of discounted. You know, so I think it depends on the group. Some other groups would be very much more like, oh, everybody can comment and blah, blah, blah. And of course, you know, my own influence in my own home group, which is when I see something that's like there isn't evidence for, or that there's evidence against. I have been known to write one or two sort of, here's the evidence on this kind of posts. So, but I think for the most part, it's a lot of anecdata, because there isn't a lot of empirical data anyway. So these are sort of great places for like crowdsourcing the information, which could be good, could be bad.
Okay. Sorry, Fiona, thank you. We have time for one more question. And Fiona, if you want to pass me the baton, I can start setting up the breakout room while you answer
I
one
made
more
you co-host,
question.
but let's make you host. There we
Okay,
go.
perfect.
But that means I can't unmute people. So I saw a physical hand up of someone who I can't quite recognize here. So Cassandra, there you go. Yes, can you unmute? There you go. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I thought that was brilliant. Really, really interesting. And I'm really interested in finding out more in the future. If you're going to do this research or other people about changes in milk composition, it's just fascinating to me because there's so much misinformation about that. My question though is, did anyone talk to you about after say 6 months or so, did they get some flack or pushback from say pediatricians, gynecologists, anybody, their own doctors, to say you can stop now? It's not, you know, the milk doesn't have any value after 6 months or something like that. Because I found that with extended breastfeeding on the breast that a lot of people that I've interviewed also.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, so I'm gonna take over and come back to you if you had anything else to add. But yes, that was definitely something that came across.
You can stop now. There's no.
Yeah, sorry, Cassandra, you were sort of breaking up a little bit, so I figured that I would just sort of take over the answer. Yeah, that was definitely something that people heard at all stages, whether it was, you know, it's my generation that's doing the exclusive pumping for the most part, right? And many of my generation's parents were formula fed. You know, so there's always that, well, it was fine for me, so it'll be fine for your kid. You know, or yeah, at certain points in time, so 6 months, 12 months, anything past 12 months, you know, there were people who were saying, well, why are you still bothering? You know, you just give them formula, like, you know, this kind of thing. So yeah, it was definitely that, and it did come from like all sources, pretty much except for lactation consultants, obviously, pediatricians, family members, but more, I would say more potentially more family members, I think. Yeah, and there were some pediatricians. Pediatricians often were just labeled as not knowledgeable about anything to do with breastfeeding, so they were just discounted generally as a source of information to do with most things. And there were a lot of quite supportive pediatricians, actually, because I think because they probably just maybe didn't know a lot about breastfeeding, and therefore it was just sort of like, well, this is great, yeah, go for it, you know.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Okay,
right.
sorry, Fiona.
Yeah.
We're out of time. We
Yeah,
need to borrow
that's for
Fiona,
sure.
but she will be coming back. Fiona, I don't think I have the rights to create the breakout room still. So
Okay.
if you could do that, if anybody is a member of the graduate faculty or is an iSchool graduate student and not a member of the committee, we're going to definitely move the committee in. But anybody in the other categories who would like to join the examination part as well, please raise your hand and we will port you to the breakout room as well. And Fiona will be back in a little bit.
Okay, I'm just going to set up a like a slideshow that's going to run while I'm gone.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm just gonna set that up. It'll just hopefully take me like 10 seconds.
And Beth, while Fiona's doing that, can you just lay out the rules for everyone? Because sometimes when we do these, the second part of the defense, it's just the committee. So a lot of people may not have experience that they're not allowed to talk, like only the committee is allowed to talk in that section. So maybe you could lay that out for everyone.
Oh, thank you. That's a good point. Yes, this is when we move into the breakout room, it's a time for the committee to basically take turns and ask questions. So if you have questions, please hold them, unless you're a committee member, please hold them until we come back to the room, or you come back to the room and Fiona will be happy to answer more questions. Thank you, Jen. Is there anything else I need to?
No,
okay,
that's it. I mean, I think sometimes people just want to kind of chime in there and you're like very explicitly not allowed to do that unless you're on the committee.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I should be sharing I'm just going to run the presentation like so people can watch it while we're in the room. Beth, I made you host, so you should be able to do the room now.
I can't figure out how to raise my hand, but just wanted to let you know this is Goggin raising.
Hi, Goggin.
Yep, thank you.
Are you okay, Beth, or you want me to do the room thing?
I see the committee room, so I'm going to go through.
You're only allowed to put people in one room, so we're going to have to all pile into the committee room and just have to invite people in and then throw everyone out when it's just the committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just check off people's names then. So Shannon, Paul, Jen, Karen, Jen, Edmund, Jen, Karen. Okay, and Fiona, can you read me the people who have their hands up that are grad students or?
Mariana Martindale.
Thank you.
Kay Sarah.
Okay, Sarah, okay.
Angela, are you a grad student or a faculty? I don't know your last name. UMD, it has to be UMD. And then did you get Goggin?
Yep, I got Goggin.
Okay.
Did Angela reply or?
I don't know. Oh,
okay.
Yeah. She said yes. And then I think Katie Lawley just put a thumbs up. So I think maybe
she wants to go. Okay.
She wants to go too. And I'm looking down the list. I think that's everybody that I would recognize from that particular crowd anyway.
Okay. Angela, could you please share your last name with us?
You can unmute yourself if you want. I don't know why this is not playing here.
If that's for the outside room, I wouldn't worry about it. You have more important things right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, we haven't heard anything back from Angela.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm trying to get this to go but it won't do it. So never mind. All right. Okay.
Hey, Angela, could you please let us know your last name? We have to make sure that you fit into one of the categories that's allowed in the examination room. Okay,
Okay, we'll just leave it.
yeah, sorry, Angela, we're gonna have to go forward. Okay. All right, I think we're gonna go now. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and we
Okay.
hope to see you in a little bit.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm just double checking that it's not following us into the room. Okay. Yeah, we'll come back.
Hey, Fiona, I think I forgot to invite you. How do I do that?
I think if you go in the room and then add me, perhaps.
Let's see. Breakout room. Committee room. Committee room. Fiona, where's Fiona? Fiona. Assign to. Okay, assign to committee room. Okay, does it show for you?
Hi, everyone. If everyone, I'm here while the committee discusses whatever. So if anyone else has any questions, then definitely feel free to ask now. If not, I'm gonna take a seat for a minute.
And I just wanted to say you did an awesome job.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're making me slightly less terrified for my own at the end of the month, but this was fantastic.
Yeah, oh, thanks. And you get the heads up of what everyone said.
Well, it's going to be interesting doing this via Zoom.
Yeah.
Well, you should definitely take a break, but I just wanted to say hi, and this was phenomenal, and I just am so in awe. That was amazing research and so well presented.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I have a million questions, but I think you need to. I think you need to take a break.
Just let it all soak in.
So I don't know how long we're going to be here for. So I'm guessing it's not going to be that long since it's 20 to 4 already. So I'm going to mute myself. I promised entertainment, I know, but no one's been very.
Sing us a song.
Oh God, no. You don't want to hear me sing. No way. No way. I'm trying to get my daughter in here. She could probably give you a good little song. So. Yeah.
Do you get to have a vacation for a while now? Just lie on the floor and stare at the ceiling, or?
No, because I'll have the final version of the dissertation to do before it gets uploaded.
Will it become published as a book?
Not as a book, no. It'll get published both online, or get online in 2 different places.
Mm-hmm.
Both ProQuest and our own online repository. But I mean, there are plans for books in general.
Yes, it needs to be a book.
So, yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, books, please.
Yeah.
Many books.
So there are plans. They're already like in the works. So yeah. 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 All right, I'm going to switch over to the live, the Facebook, the YouTube, see if anyone said anything on there. Someone was pumping during it. That's awesome. Yay. Awesome. It's exciting. Thank you all for tuning in on YouTube. We shouldn't be too much longer before things start happening again. This is sort of the weirdness of having a defense on Zoom, because usually, you know, everybody would be in the same place as well, and they'd be chatting away and whatever. But such is our time.
So Fiona, I'm dying to know, because it was such a thing during your question and answer session, what was the page count?
Before, like, that's a good question. Before appendices and references?
Just roughly. Like, what do you think the number was that Jen Goldbeck screamed out loud when she opened your file?
400.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, that's 400 before references and appendices. So. Was it hard to keep it at that? Because I know you said several times that there was so much more that you could say or wanted to say. Yeah, and the thing is, because I had so much qualitative data, I actually want to do like a word. It was over 100,000 words. With qualitative data, it's like I'd like to do a word count of how much I wrote. versus how much that I included as quotations.
Mhm. Yeah, I
So,
understand. I know that feeling of just being so mired, and for a while you feel like you're drowning before you really get any sense out of it. So congratulations for
thank
coming
you.
out with such
Thanks.
articulate and important things to say.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely understand your pain. I've been trying to publish my dissertation in journal articles, and they're usually like, you only get 8,000 to 10,000 words. And I'm like, well, that's 3 quotes probably.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think, I mean, they usually give you another couple of thousand if you're doing qual stuff, but it's still sort of tricky to fit it in, to get the nuances. I think it's hard.
Like one quote or like one other thing that I want to include with qual data, and it's very hard to compress it at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I tried not to just throw everything in. But it's like they're over 500,000 words, and my dissertation ended up being 100,000 with everything that I said. So you can see it's just an absolutely tiny proportion of what was actually said by the study participants.
Can you remind me how many participants you had?
Just over 2,000 were in the final analysis.
Oh gosh. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like 400 pages is like pretty pithy at that point with qualitative data.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the other thing is it's also having to put a lot of it into very detailed context, because so much of it is breastfeeding related, and unfamiliarity with like what's also going on in that field. So there's a lot of lit review in there too.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah.
But definitely understand your pain there.
Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah, it's really, really hard. So yeah. And then it's always that thing, when you get a review from a journal back or something, and then all the reviewers say you should add this, you should add this. And it's like, but I was already over the word count, so what do I do now? And that's always the challenge, is like not to make it any longer, but add in the things that have been requested.
So are you planning to like continue with this research after you graduate and everything's kind of done, or kind of take on a like new vein of
No,
research?
the plan is to continue. Obviously, the job market is kind of sucky right now. Yeah,
like we're pandemic.
Yeah, right, exactly. Try and find an academic job with hiring freezes in the middle of a pandemic, when you do such a cross interdisciplinary field to begin with. But I'm going to work on sort of working out a postdoc.
Okay.
So with Dr. Shinasa, who's on my committee. So Gargin, you'll know, he said something about working on stuff. So yeah, like, yeah. So that's
awesome.
sort of, pardon?
That's awesome. Like,
yeah,
being able to continue the work you're doing and things like that. I know usually like the pragmatics of like funding and like finding a way to actually continue work is not easy.
Yeah, well, there's still the pragmatics of funding, but I have a few ideas, so fingers crossed, those will sort of pan out, and we'll see. But yeah, I think I'll be staying at UMD at least for a year.
That's awesome.
Over in the School of Public Health. So yeah, we'll see. I've got to figure it out. Like, it was one of those like list of the big to-do list that you sort of make in the last few weeks of your dissertation, going like, I literally can't think about anything else right now except for my dissertation, but like I have all these other things that keep popping up, so I'm just going to put them all on a big list and deal with it when I'm done. So it's on my like deal with it when it's done list.
I made up some list.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the goal, is to like start thinking about that and start sort of putting that together. So yeah. Yep. So exciting times. But it's just, it's sort of a thing with breastfeeding research in general, is that it's just all really, really underfunded. You know, and I use the comparison in my presentation between prostate cancer and breast cancer because they're things that we hear a lot about, you know, that there's rightfully so a lot of research on them. But you know, breastfeeding is like literally millions of people every year, and it's terribly underfunded in general. And when you talk about sort of exclusive pumping, it becomes even less well-funded, I guess.
Yeah, but it's just women, Fiona. Come on.
Oh, I know. It's just women. I know. Just feed formula, right?
Just do formula.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Like, it doesn't matter.
It's natural. It comes naturally.
Yeah.
It's just interesting.
Yeah.
I was pregnant in the UK, and she has like a midwife coming to her every week or every other week, and I'm just like, what is this world you live in where they like offer you a midwife that comes to your home, and she's already like started talking to her about breastfeeding and like preparing her and things like that. And I was like, such a different world than what you would get in the US.
Yeah. That, you said that's the UK?
Yeah, she's in England right now. She's a US citizen, but they're living in England. And
that's interesting because they have some of the worst breastfeeding rates in the world.
Really? Yeah. She's been saying like how great it's been like being there, and like how different it was from like everyone she knows in the US and their experience.
Yeah, it's their breastfeeding rates, you know, like at 6 and 12 months are just like really, really bad. Like at 12 months, less than 1% are still breastfeeding in the UK. And I think part of that, like there's, I mean, there are researchers that are far more knowledgeable about it than I am, who are doing work on that in the UK. But I can certainly tell you from personal experience, like formula is like really cheap in the UK, and doesn't have sort of the some of the ingredients in the US formula that may put people off and keep them breastfeeding longer. The formulas tend to be less artificial, I guess, in the UK. And I think, and there's also a lot more, I think there's a lot more marketing of things like follow-on milk and things like that in the UK. So like in, you know, there's a marketing code, right? The WHO marketing code against breast milk substitutes, so infant formula, but it doesn't apply to like follow-on milks. So like, you know, in Europe and the UK specifically, they have these milks that are supposedly specifically designed for you know, after 6 months or whatever, and those can be marketed like any other product. So I think that's the other thing, is that there's just a lot of that marketing going on in the UK.
Got it. And I wonder if like, because she just moved there, it's like she's not quite as affected by all of it.
Yeah.
She has this great midwife, and she's shocked she gets 6 months off as maternity leave, and she's like, it'll be fantastic because her company in the US certainly wouldn't have given her 6 months paid.
Yeah.
Really excited for that, and like all of the things with baby and breastfeeding that just wouldn't have been possible here. So it's probably an interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of like, some things are better, some things are not as good potentially. Like obviously I had some UK people in my study, and you know, there's just there's even less support for pumping there, because you know, there's this sort of idea that like, oh well, you're you know, have 6 months paid, and then you can take 12 months, you know, and so you don't really need to learn about pumping because you're going to be with your baby like for 6 months without any break, you know, like, so we don't really need to talk about pumping, or we don't really need to know much about it. So it's just a lot less of a thing, you know, and our thing in America of providing pumps and you know, for free through insurance, you know, it is no replacement for parental leave at all in any way, shape or form. But I do believe that it's important to have them.
I thought about it from that perspective, like the fact that they do give so much maternity leave means that they're not as focused on pumping, even though it's still important, even with maternity leave. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of mix of things.
Fiona, I wonder if they have such a longer maternity leave. In your research or in your own personal experience, have you found that like emotional support is better, or is it worse? Like, is it better because it's set up that like these people are with their children, or is it worse because you're alone with your child and no one's checking up on you?
That's a good question. I'd have to look into that more.
No, you don't. You don't have to do anything else.
Like, no, I'm just trying to think about it, the implications of that, to be honest. I think, yeah, interesting. I think the thing, you know, specifically to do with like the UK and maybe Europe as well, I'm more familiar with the UK, just finding a lactation consultant, like it's not as much of a thing there as it is here. Like, yes, they have IBCLCs, but I actually did some calculations about like per capita IBCLC numbers. And I mean, the US definitely has the most, which is not surprising given that this is where the qualification originated. But, you know, there's not that many in the UK. They don't have, like, we have sort of the CLC qualification, which is like a lay person, but still like trained. They don't really have anything kind of equivalent. So it's either like peer supporter, like La Leche League, that kind of thing, or going all the way to like an IBCLC, who would be like a healthcare practitioner for the most part. There isn't sort of this as much of a like sort of private lactation consultant thing, because people also aren't used to getting medical or quasi-medical care from private individuals like they are here. You know, so if you have a problem, you go to the NHS. So it becomes a medical problem. So I think it's a bit, you know, like there are some communities which have fantastic peer support networks, and then there's some communities that just don't as well. So I think it's how different countries have sort of developed their lactation support networks, I guess, as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm
So
piggybacking off of like my own research, but I'm just curious about something you just said. How exactly did you find out about these peer networks? Like when you're breastfeeding, do like their doctors tell them about this, or how do you like find those resources like when you're breastfeeding? You may not know this. That was like
no, I mean, I guess, you know, like OBGYNs to some degree pass on the information. You know, I guess people Google it. You know, I think people find out a whole bunch of different ways. You know, they have like parents in their network, or, you know, they join a group on Facebook who also exist in the real world.
so like
yeah.
word of mouth kind of thing.
Pardon?
So like word of mouth and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say probably word of mouth more than anything. Yeah. Okay. So if you're not well connected in your own community, you know, or you don't know people who have had children recently, you know.
Right. It's hard to find that kind of thing, like a lactation specialist and those peer groups and things like that, especially in person.
Yeah, I mean, the lactation consultants and stuff is probably easier to find in the US because, I mean, you just look up like lactation consultant and you can find them. If you're, you know, particularly if you're in metropolitan areas, but rurally,
not as many.
There might not be one for 100 miles.
Right.
You know, and then you're, you know, for example, in the, you know, DC, Maryland, Virginia area, you have loads of lactation consultants to choose from. You know, if you don't like one, or that they didn't, you know, give you the advice you needed or whatever, then you've got plenty of choice. But you know, if you happen to only have one and within 100 miles, then you're sort of, it's either their support or no support.
Right.
Yeah.
So did you find that insurance usually covered those kind of resources?
I didn't ask. That's not something I asked. I mean, there are studies about it. There are studies on Obamacare covering lactation stuff. There have been class action lawsuits because they haven't covered it properly. In fact, I got a check from one because they didn't cover one of my visits but it doesn't, it doesn't cover things like in-home visits. So like they'll cover the lactation consultant fee, but they won't cover like the in-home fee, which is usually separate. So I mean, when you're struggling with breastfeeding and you're struggling with feeding a brand new baby, in-home visits can be the difference between success and failure, because you don't necessarily, like, it's a lot to go out, particularly if you're recovering from birth, especially if you're recovering from a C-section, for example, or you had a particularly, any particular birth injuries or anything like that. Like it's like a really tough period of time, right? So an in-home visit can be really make it or break it. But of course, some people can't afford, the $100 or whatever to pay someone to come to their house, even if the rest of the visit is covered, which it may or may not be anyway, or may not be reliably covered, or it's out of pocket, and then you have to submit.
No, that definitely makes sense. And I think that's like why my friend in England was like, her mind was blown by the fact that this person is willing to come to your home, because that's usually so, and it's all covered because it's so out of context here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that has definitely shrunk in the past few decades, though, the home visiting midwife thing. Because when I was born, I think it was like everybody got one. Everybody got a visit. I don't know. My mum's on here somewhere, so maybe she can say that. But I think now it's limited, certainly a lot more limited than it probably was. And then you've got to look at the actual costs of that in the long run. Is that actually a cost-effective measure? I don't know. Like these things, that tend to be cheaper for the whole situation. If you carry on doing something rather than cutting it out, and then you have all of these other consequences from cutting it out. But I guess that's not how the accountants work.
Wow, you mean our system is slightly broken? Very.
Oh, shocking! Yes, a system is broken. Surprise. Yeah, I think the system is probably broken in a lot of places. But we can only all do our little part to try and help the broken system along, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah. So. All right.
Fiona, I just wanted to say you're awesome.
Oh, thanks, Stephanie.
I literally came into the Zoom. I've been on YouTube for the whole time.
Well, welcome. I know the YouTube gets a little boring because you can't, actually participate in the discussion in any way. So So yeah, when I upload the video later, I'll do some significant editing so that the people who aren't watching it are going like, okay, what are they doing now?
Sorry. I had them both going, which was a lot.
Oh, because there's also a delay.
Yeah. So then I just heard our conversation happen on the YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really weird.
It was an excellent presentation, though. Note, I'm also talking to folks at the grad school who are sending you love as well, who cannot be here on the Zoom.
That's really sweet. Thank you.
Yeah. We all know you're awesome.
Thank you.
It is exceptional research, and someone had asked about leave policies and emotional support, and it's fascinating having been back in Canada, where folks have a lot of leave and not a lot of support.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely interesting to see what goes on in Canada, because there's sort of this lumped in with North America, a lot of lumped in as North America, right?
Yeah.
With the US.
Yeah.
Yet there are so many things that are very different.
So different.
Yeah. For example, like the main breast pump, like one of the major breast pumps that people like love.
Yeah.
Like just not available in Canada until relatively recently.
Like so
after my study.
What?
And it's like, so people were like, trying to get them across the border, but then of course, like they got like all sorts of customs stuff happen to them, and then they couldn't get the replacement parts like very easily because and like Amazon.com wouldn't deliver to them, and like things like that. So people would, I've seen people like trying to like ship them from the US or like that kind of thing, and it's like just weird, like kind of thing.
It is such a strange, you cannot get so many of the things just because Canada's such a tiny market. People just won't bother shipping things. But I think we should create clearly there's a desire for like a black market on breast pump parts.
Perhaps we won't talk about black markets on my defense Zoom, just saying.
Fair enough.
No, but like
just trying to get you in trouble.
I mean, I think that they've I think they're available now because I've seen people, but like I don't think that Amazon in Canada have like caught up with the like supplying the like accessories and like replacement parts as much.
Yeah, I'm sure
that's been an issue for people.
I'm sure
to try and source the actual parts. That. Yeah, and I've done lactation consultations with people in the UK and also Australia, and trying desperately to find like one or two of these things, these accessories or whatever that have just been revolutionary for people here in the States, that have made the difference between like really painful and not painful and absolutely fine, whatever, and just not being able to find them.
So frustrating.
Really frustrating. Anyway, they want me back in the breakout room.
Okay.
So
you are amazing. Get it.
Yay.
I'll be here now so I can be annoying.
Fiona.
So everyone's going to come back in to the main session. So we're just going to let them all leave their breakout room.
You said freak out room or?
Freakout room, yeah. No, breakout room. But that's funny.
That was a Freudian slip if there ever was one.
Yeah. I don't think I freaked out.
Yeah, you were very poised. Much more so than I probably will be.
You'll be fine, Gargan. You'll be fine.
Okay, thank you all for coming today. I'm very pleased to announce that Fiona has passed, and she's going to be doing some further polishing of her really excellent and important dissertation. But please join me in congratulating nearly Dr. Fiona Jardine.
Yay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Great job. Congratulations, Fiona.
Thank you. I don't know if I should stay. I don't know if anyone.
Go take a break. Go relax. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's exactly what she said.
Take your daughter for a walk. Go have a beer. I don't know, champagne, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna stick with the cider. Champagne's not my thing.
I thought about how to send you like some wine or something like here.
No, I know it's very difficult. It's like in a pandemic, it's like, you know, the whole redefining what a defense looks like.
Yep.
For sure.
Wow. Awesome. Yay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just stay here. I think I need to go hug my wife. She seems to be crying.
Oh.
Oh.
You can come in here. She's in the next room. Joe, come in here.
Oh.
Yeah. And I don't know if Georgie's there as well. She's going to be calling me Dr. Mum for a week. I'm just saying.
Fiona, Paul said congratulations. I don't know if you heard him before he. Okay. All right. Take care. Congratulations.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Fiona. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, how did I lose? Okay.
I think we're in.
Hey there.
Hi.
Hi. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congrats.
Thank you. Hi, Lillian. How are you?
There they are. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
While charting.
Thank you. Yeah. You look very official in your scrubs there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right. Congrats.
Thank you. Hi, Chris.
Hey, congratulations.
Hey, thank you for listening and hanging in there.
Absolutely.
Okay. I should probably make this not live anymore.